I think you could say the starting point of testing was the Nyaya school of Indian philosophy circa 600 BC. There is a tiny amount of evidence. There is some indication that maybe the Greeks learned about epistemology from the Indians or had heard about it. But right around 500 BC, the Greeks started exploring the topic of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. And Socrates really got that going in Greece. And so there's a long history of human thought that relates to software testing, but the software testing field itself didn't get going till the 60s. The earliest writing that we know of is from 1957. And Jerry Weinberg, who is my teacher, was on the first project that ever had dedicated testers, and that was in 1958.
What project was that?
It was a project to work on an operating system related to the space program. That's all I know. And Jerry was not a tester, he was the architect on that project, but his team decided to have dedicated testers. The reason why he thought that they were the first is that IBM held a conference of all the programmers in the world in 1961, and there was something like 400 programmers in the world in 1961. And during that conference, he said that his team was the only one that had dedicated testers. So, and everybody thought they were weird and
So
crazy to have
be-
dedicated testers.
before that, who tested? It was the people who built the projects.
Yeah, that everybody tested their own stuff. There was no idea that it was a dedicated activity. Now, in 1961, Jerry published a book with another guy. I guess he was the junior author on that book, called, I think, Fundamentals of Computer Programming. And he was, I believe, 28 at the time. But Jerry wrote a chapter in that book about testing. It's a very nice chapter on testing. I became aware of that chapter on testing because it's mentioned in the very first book about software testing, which came along in 1972, a book called Program Test Methods. And that first book, which was created out of a conference of testers, just happened to mention one of the authors in one of the papers in the book said that he was complaining that there's all this misinformation about testing that's out there. This is 1972. All this misinformation, people don't really understand testing. But there's an exception to that, and that's this one chapter that Jerry Weinberg wrote in 1961. So I went to read that. That chapter talks about testing in a very similar way that I talk about it today. And of course, I've been very influenced by Jerry Weinberg. Jerry Weinberg, remember, he wasn't a tester on that project, and he didn't write about testing really until 2005, I think. His book, Perfect Software, is a book about testing and other things, mostly about testing. So Jerry was like near testing. He was involved in testing. He knew a lot about testing, but he wasn't really in the testing industry as such. So I don't think it's right to call him the father of testing, but I like to call him the prince of software testing.
Do we know
Because
who those do we know who those dedicated testers were on that first project?
I no, he never told me, and I never asked, I guess.
Okay.
Now there's another guy working around the same time as Jerry at IBM. Jerry was a programmer at IBM. Um, and I'm suddenly blanking on his name. He wrote The Art of Software Testing, and I'm gonna have to Google him because he has he's 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 quite famous. But I'm just
Corey
blank.
Sandler?
Of course, Glenford Myers. Glenford Myers.
Okay.
Glenford Myers and Jerry, I believe, knew each other, and uh, Jerry was somehow tangentially involved with the stuff that Glenford Myers was doing. In fact, I think that Glenford Myers used a famous exercise that Jerry actually created. Jerry told me that he created the famous triangle exercise, where you think of how to test a program that calculates some stuff about triangles, which is in Glenford Myers' book, The Art of Software Testing. Now, The Art of Software Testing came out in 1979 and was quite influential. It was the first book on testing that I ever read. Um, but let me make sure I'm telling this story properly. So Jerry wrote about testing in the chapter of one of his books, on his first book, I think, in 1961. That was mentioned in the first full book on software testing, which was written in 1972. Uh, the guy who edited the first book on software testing is a guy named Bill Hetzel. I later met Bill Hetzel, and Kem Kaner and I had a long conversation with Bill Hetzel at a conference some years later, in the mid 90s it would have been. And I found Bill Hetzel to be a scintillating fellow. And Bill told Kem and I that he had a class that he taught in the 80s that was like a test planning master class. But it was a class where they spent like a week in a hotel and they worked day and night. And he gave everybody a challenge to write a test plan for this complex thing. And they researched it and they worked together, and it sounded amazing. It sounded like an amazing uh, test planning class. And I was influenced by that, and I was influenced by Bill Hetzel's systems thinking and humanistic attitudes. So Bill Hetzel edited and brought together the first full book on software testing. And I was influenced by Bill Hetzel. And I'm influenced, and I consider myself a student of Jerry Weinberg. And so those are the old testers that I know about. And that the people who were operating before 1980. I never met Glenford Myers and never spoke to him. So I don't know anything about that. I just know he was connected tangentially to Jerry and Jerry's work, that they knew of each other at least. So the way that testing evolved based on the papers that I've been able to see from the 60s, which are rather hard to track down, some of them, is that there was a lot of sort of chaos in the 60s of different people having different ideas about how to do testing. And this shook out so that by 1972, with that first book on software testing, you see in that first book on software testing lots of stuff about test cases, lots of stuff about automation. It's the like what we call traditional software testing first coalesced in 1972 in that book. And a lot of things that commentators on, LinkedIn and in conferences, whenever you see somebody talk about the history of testing, it's usually someone who's been in testing for 5 years and thinks that automation was invented in 2005. It's just ridiculous. It's like someone who thinks that the first war ever was the Vietnam War, and before that, everyone lived in peace. It's just like nuts. Uh, but on the other hand, it's not really easy to track down the history of software testing because lots of stuff happened and nobody kept track of it. So who was the first person to come up with what idea is just really tough to figure out. I think that my team in Apple was amongst the very first to think about putting test cases in spreadsheets and then using that to drive automation, so-called data-driven automation.
Right.
And I believe that we were amongst the first in the industry to do that because spreadsheets had only been invented like 6 years before. And when I did this work, I did it at Apple Computer, where we had a team of 400, a big group of 400 testers testing all of Apple's stuff. And I knew that we were the only people in Apple doing that.
Right.
So there could have been somebody else in the industry doing this, but it was a new idea, and none of us had heard of it.
Isn't
But
it
when I
funny that we use that as well when we work together? We use spreadsheets to create
very
right.
it's a very natural idea. And the reason why we wanted to do it is we wanted to separate the code part of the automation from the data part so
Right.
that the testers would have an easier time adding new test ideas. See, when I worked in automation for the first time, it was 1987, everyone around me was focused on automation. So if you see any LinkedIn posts about how everyone did manual testing until 1999, when the first person discovered that computers can help us. Okay, so we were all working with automation in 1987 at Apple Computer. So, you know, I was there. We were doing my first day at Apple Computer doing testing was May 21st, 1987, and I wrote 12 test scripts that I coded in basically a scripting language, a batch scripting language, to drive a compiler and a linker at that time. So I was testing command line tools. Of course, you're going to use automation to test command line tools. GUIs were brand new.
Right.
87, so that's 3 years after the Mac came out, popularizing GUIs. I had not worked with a graphical user interface before I came to Apple. I'd seen some text GUIs, kind of, but I'd never seen Windows. Windows was either brand new or hadn't been invented yet in 87. So the whole issue with GUI automation was not really a thing when I started, but it became a thing in the next few years. And then we had to scratch our heads about, how to deal with these with testing GUIs after that. And Apple Computer, I believe, created the first GUI testing tool called Virtual User. And that was created by a team right next to my team. I worked with those guys and was in the same staff meetings with them and heard about the difficulties they had in creating this thing and all the headaches that it created for testing. And then we've been dealing with those headaches ever since.
Right.
So the key dates are 1961, or I would say 1958, when the first team that had testers in it in our industry was created. 1961, when the first good chapter on software testing was written in Fundamentals of Computer Programming. And I have that chapter. Jerry actually gave me permission to type it in and post it online. I've never gotten around to doing that. But I'd like to do that someday because he talks about it in an interesting and creative way. And then 1972, when a big conference happened on software testing, it may have been the first testing conference, but a book came out of that conference. And in that book, the foundation of what we now call traditional testing was laid. And that traditional testing is make sure you have complete specs and then write a bunch of test cases. And then if you can, automate the test cases. That all that stuff is in that book.
Right. And it's still with us today. And it's going really strong.
And then what that did is that threw us down the wrong road, I believe, because what people thought then is that this human skill was not that big a deal because the computers will test themselves. Now, there is also a television commercial from 1956, actually a primetime TV commercial, and I have the video of it. And it shows this spokesman talking about the new UNIVAC computer and how great it was. And at one point in the commercial, he shows that the UNIVAC can test itself. And he has it do these checks where it says memory, okay. Unit processor 1, okay. And he goes, see? Like, they could easily have faked that. But it shows that this idea that, hey, maybe we could just make computers test themselves is a popular idea from technocrats going way back. It is not a new idea.
Right.
An important thing to understand that a lot of modern kids don't know is that smart people weren't invented in the 2010s. Smart people have been around for a long time, and probably even before 1960 there were smart people.
Yeah.
And so all the things that you might think would be a good idea to do testing, I guarantee you we were thinking about it in 1980 and 1970 and 1960. I'll tell you that in 1993, when I spoke at my first big testing conference, I had lunch with a guy named John Musa. And John Musa is a software reliability expert from AT&T. And he told me about how when AT&T puts out their phone systems, their business phone systems that companies would buy, that they would get logging information about how people were using the systems automatically sent back to their offices.
Right.
So this idea of monitoring something in production,
Mhm.
he told me about in 1993, and I thought, oh, that's such a cool idea. I wish my company could do that. We
Right.
didn't have the internet back then. I mean, we had the internet. We just didn't, nobody used the internet outside of academia until it started getting big around 1993, 1994. I first went online on the internet itself in 1994, and there wasn't a lot of people I could talk to in industry. It was mostly academics. That quickly changed because the web came along
Right.
and started becoming big right around 1994. The first browser came out, and was that's the first time I used a browser was around 1994, and and then it started getting real interesting. But for instance, when I worked at Apple, we had email, but we didn't have email that went to any other company. It was an internal email system called Apple Link that we all, but that rapidly changed.
Right.
And so my first internet enabled email address, I think I got it in 1990, end of 1993. And then it just began to be possible to have telemetry, but we didn't have broadband yet. Everything was dial up until about, well, 1999. Broadband started becoming a thing. In 2001, my the company that I started, Satisfice, we installed a T1 line, which is a 1.5 megabit broadband. That was broadband back in those days. That was wicked fast
Right.
in 2001, 1.5 megabits. Um, and now I've got 1,000 megabits coming into my house here, and it costs the same as my 1.5, 500 a month for 1.5 megabit internet in 2001. Only It's only broadband that makes it feasible to start doing continuous delivery and monitoring of things in production and all the cloud stuff. It only becomes practical with very, very fast internet.
So
But
is that,
testing,
yeah,
testing, all the ideas we had in testing, other than ideas that require super fast internet, we were doing those things back in 87 and
right.
throughout the
So
90s.
are you saying that one of the reasons maybe that they went away from waterfall is because of internet and they incorporated agile instead?
No,
No.
no, no. The reason why waterfall collapsed, waterfall, the myth of waterfall anyway, the reason why, the general idea of let's get all our specs up front and figure out what we want to do, and then let's start implementing step by step the plan that we put together. Reason why that fell apart, if you want to understand that, you need to understand why it existed in the first place. The reason it existed in the first place is because all computing, pretty much all computing, up until about 1982, was large scale mainframe based systems. And those systems, you don't you don't buy them at a store. You don't buy them. Of course, you don't buy them online. What you do is you're a multi-million dollar company and you contact IBM and they send a salesman and they work this stuff out. And then you say, well, I need this software created. And then you hire them to create your software. And of course, the first thing you're going to say is, well, what do you want? Well, let's work out the contract. So, contract based development held sway until the microcomputer revolution. It was the microcomputer revolution, which got big in the starting in the early 80s. The consumer computing, small computer, business computing revolution. That revolution created market driven software products instead of contract driven. So now instead of going to a place and saying, I have an idea for a product that I need, I'll pay you $1 million or $5 million to develop it. Can your company do this for me, IBM? And IBM says, sure, we'll do it. It'll be $10 million, but we'll do it. Instead of that, you would have companies that create a product like a computer game, and then they sell it at a store and they say, we don't know if people are going to buy this. We'll put it in the store. We'll see if they buy it. So that's market driven.
Right.
Market driven software development. It doesn't make sense to do it in a waterfall way.
No.
Because you don't have your customers saying, here's exactly what we will buy.
Right.
You can't go and talk to your customers like that. So you're guessing what your customers will want. So that is what created the initial engine of agility. Is we try something, we tweak it, we try something, we tweak it. We say maybe this is what people will buy. Yeah, this feels pretty good. And then you put it out there and you see if they like it.
Right.
That market only started existing in the mid 80s. It got big for business in the mid 80s. And that's when I got into business. And that's when I never touched a mainframe. I was always with microcomputers from 1981. And my first job was in 1983. So I came in with the microcomputer revolution. My entire career has been that. So I never worked in a high waterfall environment.
Right.
Never.
That's
But we didn't have agile yet. We didn't have everything that agile is said to be. We didn't have that in the early 80s, but we had the sentiment of agile. Incremental development, being willing to change your mind about things, small teams, all that stuff. We called them tiger teams. Now they're called agile teams, but we called them tiger teams at Apple in the old days.
Let's go back to your first job. And it was not as a tester, it was as a developer of video games, right?
Well, my first job was selling computers.
Right. Okay.
I didn't succeed in selling any computers.
So let's not use that then.
And I broke one. So that was 6 months that I spent doing that at a office supply store in Iowa. And then a guy walked in and wanted to know if I knew how to program, and I did. And so that's how I got my job doing video games.
Right. And in your book, Secrets of a Buccaneer Scholar, you go through your experience developing video games and then getting a job at Apple. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So I met this guy, walked into the store. His name is Dale Disharoon. for some reason, he later changed his name to D. Sharon from Disharoon. I don't know. Both names seem kind of crazy to me. Um, but he walked into the store. He was a former kindergarten teacher who liked computers and wanted to do games. And so he was the game designer, and he needed programmers to help him make this thing a reality. So starting January 1st, 1983, I was working in his living room. I then got promoted to his laundry room. And then he built a garage, and I worked in his garage.
Sounds
Um,
lucrative.
say again?
Sounds it was very lucrative.
It was actually it was pretty lucrative. He ended up buying a very nice house with the money that we made. I mean, he paid me 3 times as much as I was making at the office supply store. That was my opening salary was he tripled my income immediately. I had been making minimum wage, so it wasn't that big a deal, but it was a big deal to me. So this was in Iowa, and then I followed him. He moved to California, so I moved to California to follow him and lived in an apartment underneath his apartment, and we worked like that for a while, and then uh, and then we moved to Chico, California, uh, and at that point I had made enough money from him that I could live on for an entire year. So I quit
Right.
because I was burned out. I kept burning out as a programmer, and I didn't know why. I'm in my teens, right? I dropped out of high school, so I'm 17 years old, and I'm burned out.
Right.
And I didn't know why. I didn't know how burnout works. I didn't know what was making me burned out. It wasn't overwork. Overwork is not what makes you burn out. Well, doesn't make someone like me burn out. What makes you burn out is when you are not getting the vitamins and minerals from your work that you need. The vitamin that I needed was social interaction. I was working alone almost all the time,
Right.
and I got really lonely, and I need social stimulation.
Yeah.
So I just can't work like that. But I didn't know it at the time. I just thought I keep burning out. I don't know why. And when I say I burned out, I mean at one point I would get physically ill, like I'm gonna throw up if I saw a keyboard. I mean, that's pretty burned out.
That's burnout. Yeah.
Later on, I was burned out a second time before I got out of my 20s. I got burned out a second time. And in that episode, I developed a phobia of email that lasted probably 6 months.
Mhm.
So I couldn't come near email. I couldn't see email. It was just like, I can't look at it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know how successful I was at hiding this phobia from people, but that's burnout. That's real serious burnout when you just kind of psychologically can't cope.
Yeah.
And so I learned, Jerry Weinberg taught me how to avoid burnout when I was 28 years old, I think. And it worked. And I've never been burned out in a hard way. I've got tired or taken breaks, but I've never been completely unfunctional ever since.
What
So
What is the secret recipe?
the secret recipe to avoiding burnout:
Yeah.
there's a voice in your head that's telling you no, and you're ignoring it. You can ignore it. You can keep ignoring it, but there are consequences to ignoring that voice. I just stopped ignoring that voice. I started taking it real seriously.
Yeah.
when it's kind of like pain. If you feel pain, you can ignore the pain, but you really, really do not want to ignore pain. Pain is a message to you, and you intuitively know that pain is very important and you should not ignore it. But the little voices in your head are very easy to ignore.
Yeah.
The little voice that says, I don't want to do this. Oh, but it would be a lot of money, so we should do it. Well, but I don't want to do it. Well, we're going to do it because it's a lot of money. I need the money. I want the money. We're going to say yes to this. I don't want to do it. Now I don't dismiss that little voice. That's the number one thing. The number one thing is I follow my intuitions about how much is too much, which things are the wrong thing,
Right.
and I try to keep my spirit, my intuition aligned with my promises. As long as I only promise to do things that my intuition wants to do, I'm on pretty safe ground.
Right. And
That
yeah, you took 1 year off and then you applied to Apple Computers.
Well, I didn't take 1 year off. I took less than a year off because I got a girlfriend and then I married her right after I turned 18, and she spent all my money. So I had to go back to work for Dale Dish Room. So I
Mm.
went back. I was only out for about 6 months. And then I started working for Dale again, did more games for him.
Mhm.
And then I started suffering from burnout after about another 18 months as I started dealing with burnout symptoms again. Also, there was a big industry downturn. There was the bottom fell out of the computer games market in 1980, end of 85, 86. So work dried up and Dale didn't have as much for me to do anyway. And so I started putting out feelers. Somebody said that there might be jobs in Silicon Valley, so I put my resume out there, and it happened to be seen by a recruiter who happened to know somebody at Apple Computer who thought who wanted to work with someone like me.
Right.
And someone like me is very young, so I was 20 at the time they hired me, and young and unconventional and enthusiastic. I was basically a project. I was a Frankenstein monster that this particular guy, Chris Brown at Apple Computer, he took me on as a project. He liked the idea of having a young guy that he could mentor.
Right.
So he was my after Dale was my first mentor, you might say. Dale taught me to drive. Dale got me to play a musical instrument. Dale pushed me to do various little things and got me to understand what professional work was all about. Chris Brown introduced me to the corporate world and how to behave as a manager because I was hired as a manager, which is weird because I'd never done any management.
So you were
I was
probably the first, the youngest manager at
I was
Apple.
I was the youngest manager at Apple Computer. There were interns that were older than me, and they had a they had a rule that you have to have a computer science degree, and they just ignored that rule, which they are always able to do. Like people have rules, companies have rules, but there are people in companies who can suspend those rules if they feel like it, unless it's a rule that relates to some legal thing.
Right.
These things are just policies that people put in place and other people can suspend them. In fact, sometimes you get people in the corporate world who like displaying how powerful they are by suspending rules that they think other people have to follow, but my group isn't going to follow this rule. So for that reason, I always recommend that just if you want to apply for a job that you think you'd be good at, ignore the requirements and apply for it.
Yep.
Make the case about why you would be good to hire. And there might be a personality match. There might be a match of spirit between you and the person who has the power to hire for that. And they'll just shrug and bring you in. Hiring is a very personal, emotional decision.
Yeah.
It's for that reason that I can never feel bad if I don't get a job. It's like feeling bad if you go on a date and the person doesn't like you. It's like, we're not compatible. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be compatible with everybody in the world, nor would I want to be. I don't want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with me. I want to be with someone who irrationally thinks I'm amazing. That's who I want to be with. So I'm going to hold out until I get to the person who irrationally wants me. And that's what I did. And I've been married 33 years. Apple started sending me to management training classes, and I learned how to be a manager, all those things, and got experience and started growing up.
Mhm.
But
And
I was like a weird kid raised by wolves when I first came into Apple, because I didn't even know how do you be in a building. I had never worked in a building before that wasn't a garage or a living room or a private residence. I didn't know like where you're supposed to park. Like, how do you come in? Do you say hello to the guards each time? I mean, what's a conference room? Can you just use a conference room anytime you want? Do you have to ask somebody?
right. And one of my favorite stories that you told me is that when you got to Apple, you didn't really know what to do. So what you did was to go over the street with books from Apple and get a bunch of donuts and just you sat there reading all day.
Yeah, there was a donut place across the street from 10500 De Anza Boulevard. I think it may still be there now, called the Donut Wheel, run by these Cambodian refugees. And people in those days, there was no laws against smoking indoors, so it was like often full of smoke. And I'd sit there, and the way Apple management works in the corporate side of things, no one was paying attention to whether I was in the office or not. So, I mean, I guess they thought maybe I was off in the gym working out, or, so I would spend hours most days reading books and computer science papers and trying to imagine better ways of testing.
Right.
And that I did a lot of that at Apple. I was hell bent on being an innovator. I wanted to transform testing. Now, at the very beginning, I couldn't believe that there wasn't a manual at Apple Computer for how to do testing. Like, no one had bothered to write anything that would give you an orientation. You just join the testing group. Here's what you need to know. There was no orientation thing. So even in the first few weeks I was at Apple, I sort of raised my hand and said, hey, maybe I should write a binder of how to start being a tester at Apple, so that at least the next group of people who get hired will have something to read. And in that way, I became kind of a testing methodologist from my very earliest days.
Right. And that's what
People
you're
say,
known for
yeah,
now. Right.
singing.
And that's what you're known for now as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got rewarded for doing that. And that's why, probably out of all 400 people who worked at Apple at that time on testing, because we were all in one building,
Mhm.
I'm probably the only person still in the testing industry out of all those people, because they've either retired, probably rich if they stayed at Apple.
Mhm.
I didn't stay at Apple, though, and this is important for the history of testing. I stayed at Apple 4 years, and then I got depressed and left. And my depression was driven by two things. One, I got divorced from my training marriage, my first marriage. And I was lonely, and so I was distracted and not really putting a lot of energy into work anyway. Um, and so I decided, and then I had a breakup with a girlfriend, a messy breakup. And to deal with that, I decided I was going to travel around the world. And while planning that, I met Lenore, who I am now married to, and she worked in another group at Apple. And so I married her the day after my last day at Apple Computer, and then decided I wasn't going to go around the world after all. And that's when I got my job at Portland. But the thing is the reason why I was depressed is I couldn't get anybody interested in excellent testing
Right.
because Apple was too fat and lazy. They kept saying, well, everything we touch turns to gold, so who cares?
Right.
And I said, well, who cares is our users. We want to do good products. That's why we even have testers. Quality matters.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, but we have quality. It's quality is easy. So like, why are you're just obsessed, James? You're obsessed. So in those days, I used to say that I was really interested in quality. I'm really not interested in quality. I think I misunderstood my own motivations. Quality is what a lot of testers think matters to them.
Right.
But I think a good number of those people, they're not really that interested in quality. What
No.
what they're interested in, I think, is the truth.
Yeah.
And they're interested in being responsible. And like, I want to know the truth about the product. Is this a good product? And is it responsible of us to release this product to our users? Now, of course, that's all related to quality. Of course it is.
Sure.
But it's not like quality itself is what's exciting to me. The excitement to me is the feeling of being on a team that's doing a great job.
Yeah.
I want to be on a crack team. I really want to be on the Olympic team of software development,
Yeah.
the Olympic team of testers. I'm inspired by people who reach for excellence. I want to be among those people.
Yeah.
But my world is software, so it's software testing specifically. So this is what I have to work with. So I was trying to innovate, talk about risk-based testing and all kinds of stuff way back in 90, 80, 88, 89. It just no one seemed to care. There's a lot of apathy.
Yeah.
So and then in 1989, a big thing happened, which is related to today's world of testing.